Hello, I'm Logue, and this is Let's Talk Consciousness. And I'm going to go into a topic that I say this a lot, gives me pause or some sense of reluctance, but every time I think that, there is also a parallel thought, which is a lot of the videos that I've done and even just conversations in real life. It's interesting to see that they do land with some people. You do get through to some people in some meaningful way if you share what it is you have to say, particularly if it's from the heart. And then maybe a much larger number of people who just don't give a shit and it doesn't have any relevance to them. So anyway, with that in mind, I'll share it anyway. And up front, just a warning: it is about the topic of sexuality, so it's there's nothing graphic, but just in the sense that can make some people uncomfortable. I say it now, so you can stop watching if that bothers you. But it is about the topic mainly of porn, and I'm not really interested in laying any guilt trips on anybody or telling anybody what to do. It's really not about that. It's more of just a testimonial of an experience of seeing what it's like to just release it and disconnect from it, and seeing how that might change your day-to-day life. And in another sense, I think people talk about this a lot, but the way it kind of rewires your brain, that's particularly as a new generation of people, it's hitting them at a much younger age, and we are now finding out what that will do to human brains in terms of development. So it's an interesting thing, but again, not no guilt trips, not laying any sort of prescription for your behavior. I'm just sharing what it's like for me, deciding several months ago to just say, I think I'll see what it's like to just do without that 100% and see what happens. So before I get to that, I'm going to give just a brief background in terms of my attitude and particularly Christianity, and the impression that it made on me at a young age, and then growing out of it, and I'll be brief. But basically, I was born in '84. I grew up in the suburbs. My parents weren't particularly religious. They were Jehovah's Witnesses before I was born, and I was the last kid of four, and they were pretty much done with it. So I never got taken to church. I saw one baptism of a family member, but I was not nothing was really being impressed on me. I would ask the kind of normal questions you ask as a kid and get the Sunday school answers, but if I wasn't asking, they weren't bringing it up. So when the outer world started telling me what to do in terms of guilt trips about sexuality, being told that masturbation's a sin, and from the more Catholic perspective that to even lust after someone is a sin in your own mind, and all these things were there for me to hear, and primarily it would be the parents of other kids that I would hang out with. Not all of them, but if just one or two of those parents are really like kind of holy rollers, they can cram in a lot of information in just a few conversations. But so that's I had a Mormon family, a friend that his parents were Mormons, and some just kind of what you might call regular Christians. Just kind of like the general uh, set of assumptions of Christianity. So I was really repulsed by that when I got to the point where I started liking girls and wanting to have sex. I was 12 years old when I figured out how to masturbate, and it just immediately created this kind of existential crisis, because I understood at that point from years earlier that the concept is you ask for forgiveness for your sins, or else you go to hell. And if you didn't get a chance to do that before you die, and this is more of the Catholic impression, I think, you're automatically going to hell. And so, as a kid, you're being told that like your existence in the afterlife, heaven or hell, will depend on whether or not you say the magic words right before you die. That just seemed really absurd to me. But then the bigger implication that if this is a loving God, the idea that they would send you to hell for doing the thing you're naturally inclined to do, and not having the correct spiritual contract in place, or say the right words, just the absurdity of that. I mean, it that kind of broke my mind in terms of becoming a doubter of religion. And by the time I was 18, 19, I was just an atheist outright, and then came to something else. But my point is that kind of attitude about sex was really repulsive to me. And I remember in particular there was a show on MTV in the 90s. It was like their kind of attempt at documentaries, or half-hour documentaries. I cannot remember what they're called. But there was this interview with this Southern Baptist, old white guy, and he said the strangest thing in regards to masturbation that I just thought was so fucking strange, that this is the way this guy sees the world. he was saying that he wished on a biological level that we were incapable of tricking our minds into the sexual experience by ourselves, meaning he would prefer a world where you had to basically go through the rungs of getting married and get the right spiritual arrangement in place, in terms of like heaven and hell, and if it makes God angry, before you have sex, and that should be the only way you should have any sort of sexual release. To me, that would make for a completely miserable world and probably a lot of violence. But it was just a strange thing that his temptation was so off-putting that he just wished to not have it. I think was probably the better. I think that was really the thing he was expressing, but it was just so strange to me. I remember at an early age thinking, these people are fucking crazy. Like, how could you not be into this? Um, so yeah, that's where we parted ways. Basically, is when I got to that age. Uh, so getting back to the subject of porn, it is. From that kind of liberation and that attitude that I would have felt that pornography is a good thing, that saying yes to the sexual impulse is a good thing. That was basically the attitude I had, and I still generally hold that attitude. I mean, I think it is any way you can extract guilt from that process is good. I mean, I think you can see the way fear and guilt and oppression results in really, really distorted behavior, and that's, I think, in the larger context of the sexual harassment revelations that are going on. These characters seem to be people who have something. Their antenna is bent in some way. Like, they don't have normal access to the sexual impulse that you might say a person born in this generation tends to have. That's not a guarantee that you're not going to be a fucking creep. But that's my point is that as attitudes change and as the kind of avenues and access have changed, I think that does free up a lot of the weird distortions that happen in people where they become, that they assault other people in some way. That's another subject. But my point, to get back to it, is that I had a pro pornography attitude and an attitude of generally it is good to release the guilt. And so in that sense, I was for it. That would be, an attitude that developed over time as a teenager and in my 20s. I'm in my 30s now, and I'm, from particularly my late 20s to now, have explored different like spiritual disciplines, and I don't have like an amazing meditation practice or routine. Like, it's kind of when I can really, the stars align and I have free time to do it. But I do take an interest when somebody sets a certain rule for themselves to see if they can follow it and how that pans out. And that's not exactly what happened in my case. I know it's getting 7-8 minutes in and I haven't made my point. But the approach of having a discipline or a rule about yourself just to see what you could do with it, I think, is kind of interesting. And so whether that's meditating or focusing on forgiving people, trying to forgive yourself, to internal work, basically, that if you set aside time every day to do these things, or that I think that's interesting. I see what people build on that, and I'm fascinated, and it's giving me reason to look for ways to do that myself. So that's part of what I want to bring up. So why did I decide to disengage from it now? I'm married, and I'll reveal a little bit of the content of the relationship just as it pertains to this, but not overshare. But basically, I'm married with 2 kids, and whatever kind of stressors and complications that have from raising young children, which is incredibly difficult if you didn't already know that. That it's the hardest time in a person's life, basically, is the early childhood. It's just the most taxing of all your resources, if I could put it that way. But anyway, in the kind of stressors that creates, and then just the fact that you very rarely have time to be alone with your partner, it's fucking insane how much, with 2 kids and 3 dogs, and in-laws coming over, and like all these things that have to just line up perfectly for you to have a little free time. It's pretty amazing how easily that can be thwarted. So like, you get into this place where I think this probably hit more with married people. You have pornography as this like alternate route, and particularly if you're in kind of conflict and you're not seeing eye to eye, and intimacy is less and less likely, it's easy to divert your energy that way. And that doesn't really say anything for like teenagers and young people. I'll get to that in a moment. But in that context, that you can kind of like sabotage yourself a little bit in having the energy to try to repair your relationship, or just come out of a kind of rougher time. That's one thing that I got from this, is that when I am not, it's actually, to be specific, it's not that I'm not masturbating, I'm not using porn. And I know it's kind of an overshare, but I think this is important. Uh, but it's in the fact that I have to place a demand on myself to actually try harder to make, opportunities to have sex with my wife more available to me. And when you have a little bit more of a store up of testosterone, you actually find that you get a little bit more energetic and creative about creating those opportunities. And that's my point, is that if you're constantly depleting your energy that way with porn surfing, it really takes away from the kind of gusto that you would normally have in trying to get laid, basically. And that can apply to single people too. In fact, I think it's even a bigger call to single people to not store up, I don't want to put it that way, I mean, just a side point, there is a certain discomfort with sitting on that energy, and it's not always good, but it does actually get easier, and you get a little better at redirecting it and trying to put your kind of impulse for the sexual release into the creative release. Because sex is a creative act, particularly if you're looking at it in a spiritual way. So having that direction of trying to harness the energy, and granted, it's kind of, there's some discomfort with it at first in particular, but you get a certain rhythm going with it, and it does kind of put this bigger imperative on you to line up those stars to get your opportunity. And so if you're a single person, that could go a different way, but for a married person, it's basically just finding time and privacy, and that's the challenge. So more about the other side of it, the from a younger perspective, I was raised in the age of the internet, so I had access to it by the time I was about, I mean, I actually saw porn before I started masturbating. I saw it as like 8, 10, and then by 12 figured that part out. And yeah, that's probably too young. That's, the internet, I was on AOL in the early 90s, and nobody was really paying attention to what kids were doing, and they still aren't now, by and large. I mean, some are. Some, parents check in on their text messages and Facebook messages, and they approach it a different way. But that's like a reaction to many years that we were not doing anything. So my point is, in terms of how it might affect your perception, there's the obvious things that, you might expect a woman in real life to look a different way, to behave a different way. Those are all valid. But I find a different avenue is, you can create this kind of short path to this dopamine reward that your brain is going to give you, to the point where you actually lose interest in the physical act. And it might, particularly if you're young and maybe you've never been with anybody and you've just had porn, there is a physicality to really having sex that you need to experience to understand what you're missing out on. Using your whole body to do this and to share it with somebody else, and I'll get to the kind of spiritual side of it. If you are kind of a metaphysical thinker, and maybe you're inclined to think the chakra systems are real, this idea of in Eastern philosophy of basically suppressing the release and storing up the energy. There's something to that. I actually like to have a kind of spiritual mindset in those moments, with my wife, and it makes it for a fuller experience, because you can have kind of the crass, like, dirty fantasy kind of side of it, and that's nice too. There's nothing wrong with that. But I find just focusing on the moment and not making it about anything else, and this kind of like rising of, I know it sounds weird, but visualizing energy rising through your spine, it actually helps. And just slow, deep breaths. It, even as just an amateur looking at how tantra is depicted, it's like, oh, there is something to this. There is something to redirecting your mindset and your energy. But you'll have to try it for yourself to figure it out. But so it's just kind of a warning, I guess, and a testimony that you can get diverted on this track that is, there's nothing wrong with it, and I'm not judging it, but it can really take you in a direction that's kind of far removed from the immediate experience and the kind of psychological satisfaction that goes along with actually making it happen. The effort that pays off with reward. And granted, you're going to get frustrated at times. You're going to put in effort and get no reward because something tripped it up, and some obstacle got in the way that just made it so it wasn't going to happen. And Actually, another example. There's a meme that I can't remember exactly where it started, but it's the cartoon Arthur, and it's just like four panels, and it's his fist in this one screen cap, and then a text message to a girl that doesn't answer, and then the next is his fist with a load on it, and then the text message from the girl, and it's like fuck, and there's that thing where if you give up too easily, you'll pass up an opportunity that comes your way. So if you're, I don't know, I'll just be crass. If you're constantly cranking it, like, you're probably less likely to get laid. And I really like getting laid. I think porn surfing is just okay. And so my advice to you is to take some time to choose carefully what you want to do with your energy. And it's like giving up an addiction. It's not easy, and your neural pathways that are established are going to want to stay there. But if you can ride it out for just 2 weeks or so, it's a big difference. And this is particularly, guys, is I'm 30, almost 34, and as you get later in age, I hate to say it, young people, this is a warning, your dick will feel different as you age. And how responsive it is, and how limber it is. I know this is too graphic, but I gotta say it. When you extract yourself from porn surfing, just sitting in front of a monitor or a tablet for hours, or some people do, getting up to take bathroom breaks and coming back to it, your dick feels like toast. Like, it's just not good compared to how you feel when you're not porn surfing. And I didn't stop masturbating. I just stopped using porn. So it's like the conditions are different, and the kind of unnatural prolonging of it is different. And yeah, this is really graphic. I'm sorry, but it's something that I feel like sharing. So I advise all of you to try just seeing the benefit in the long picture, the big picture, that giving up something momentarily can really lead to some big rewards. And find somebody to get laid with in an honest and direct way. And if you're not in relationships, and if you can honestly depict what you want, and if you're not playing games with people, I think you can actually have that kind of psychological reward and none of the guilt that goes along with it. But it's difficult. But being honest and direct in that way is a real asset. It just means getting rejected a lot more. But go get laid.